Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous and this is part 55 in a 10-part video series in which we're learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. What I'll be talking about in this particular video is how to determine whether a variable should be an input parameter or an attribute. Let's take a look. As you can see here, I have a flow chart to help you if you're brand new to Orchestrator. If you're a beginner and you're trying to make that determination of whether a variable should be an input parameter or an attribute, it basically works like this. You ask yourself, do I want the user to be in control over the value that's stored in this variable? If the answer is yes, then we'll create an input parameter by going to the Inputs tab. That's what input parameters do. Input parameters allow the user to set the value. On the other hand, if I don't want the user to have control over the value of the variable, I would instead go to the General tab and create an attribute. By the way, if you missed the previous video, I am assuming here that we're using the older legacy Java-based vRO client. If you're not familiar with the difference between the older and newer client, take a look back at video 54 because there's some important info there. But again, from a beginner's perspective, deciding whether to create an input parameter or an attribute is pretty straightforward. If you want the user to have control over the value, you create an input parameter. On the other hand, if you want you yourself, the Orchestrator workflow developer, to have control, you create an attribute instead. Again, that's beginner's view. Now let's look at this flowchart, which, as you can see from the title bar, is still pretty rudimentary. This is just how to think about it if you're a beginner. As you can see, this flowchart looks very similar to the last one, but whereas in the previous flowchart there was just one decision where you're deciding whether or not you want the user to have control over the value, here we've got two decisions to consider. So the first question I ask myself is, does the user understand what on earth we're asking for? For instance, if I had an input parameter that asked the user to pick a name for a virtual machine, that's pretty straightforward. Assuming the user knows what a virtual machine is, they'll know what I mean if I ask them for the name. On the other hand, if I ask the user to select a AD computer or a VC distributed port group or crazy things like that, the user doesn't necessarily know what I'm asking for. So in that case, if the user doesn't understand what the question is, I probably should create an attribute. On the other hand, if the user understands what the question is, I might not trust the user. Now, I don't mean to besmirch your end users, but the fact of the matter is that some end users are malicious, and if we give them the ability to feed in information into our workflow or programs in general, it's very possible that we're one day going to encounter somebody who's got a mean, nasty streak to them, and they're going to try to send in data that might cause our workflow to blow up, or might cause problems in our infrastructure, or might cause a resume generating event. So if I don't trust the user, I'm going to create an attribute, because creating an attribute is going to give me control over what the value is. It's going to give me, the Orchestrator developer, control so that that user can't do mean things to me in my career. On the other hand, if I think that the user understands the question and the user is trustworthy, then if the answer to both these questions is yes, I'll create an input parameter. So again, either I'm going to go to the Inputs tab to create an input parameter or the General tab to create an attribute, but from a beginner's perspective, these are the two questions that you ought to ask yourself. But you're probably not a beginner. You are probably more advanced. So let's go forward one more slide and take a look at a more complete flow chart. And again, this is a flow chart that's illustrating how I think about determining an input parameter versus an attribute. This may not match what every Orchestrator developer does, but this flow chart, in this way of thinking, has served me very well for more than a decade. So in this flow chart here, where we're going to more completely describe my thought process, you can see that the beginning part is the same as we saw in the previous flow chart. So the first two questions I ask myself are, Does the user understand what I'm asking for? And do I trust that user? As we saw before, if the answer is yes to both of those questions, I'm going to go to the Inputs tab and create an input parameter. On the other hand, in the previous flowchart, we said that if the answer to either of those questions was no, that we would create an attribute. But the truth of the matter is, I don't immediately jump straight to creating an attribute. Instead, I go through this thought process. If the answer to either of those questions was no, what I'm going to do, instead of just automatically creating an attribute, is I'm going to ask myself, can input parameter presentation, that's the stuff that you set up by going to the Presentation tab. If you haven't seen that before, why don't we flip over real quickly to our lab environment and take a look. So here we are in an Orchestrator workflow, and as you can see, in addition to the Inputs tab where I create input parameters, there's this Presentation tab where I can go to specify for each of my input parameters whether I want them to be treated in a special way. So for instance, if I have an input parameter, I'm just going to create one real quickly here. So I'll go to Inputs tab to create it. If I have an input parameter called whatever, and it's something like a string, and I'm going to type a description, because you always do that with input parameters. So tell me your favorite color. So if I have an input parameter that's going to ask the user for their favorite color, I can go to the Presentation tab and control things about how that input parameter is going to behave. Now notice when I go to the Presentation tab, the variable input parameter that I just created has been copied over. So here's whatever. That's the name of my input parameter. It's a string, and the description that I typed previously is here on the right side. If I select an input parameter while I'm on the Presentation tab, over on the right side of the screen, I have this Properties section where I can add properties, presentation properties, to this input parameter. Let me add one. So if I add a property, I can say things like, this input parameter is mandatory. So I do so by adding the property, and then I say, yes, that's mandatory. But as you can see, there's lots of other properties besides mandatory input. We have other properties for string variables, such as the default value. Perhaps I want to have a default value such as blue. Maybe blue is their favorite color. And other input parameter properties, presentation properties, such as the maximum string length. So I could say, for instance, the maximum string length here is, why don't we say 20 characters. If they type something longer than 20 characters, they're probably either don't know how to answer the question or they're being malicious. So I could limit the number of choices we give them. Plus, there are other properties that we could add, such as, instead of giving the user a drop-down list, there are properties that allow us to do things such as, instead of using a text field, I can use an input parameter presentation property to say I want a drop-down list in which I hard code the values so that the user can only choose from the legal values that I've specified. So if it's an input parameter, it's possible that instead of creating an attribute, it's possible that I could create an input parameter and set up these properties to control the input that the user gives. Again, I could do so in such a way by having defaults. That would be useful in the case of a user who doesn't know how to answer the question, or by specifying things like the maximum string length, or forcing them into a drop-down list where they can only choose choices I give them. Those are ways of helping us with those potentially malicious users. So there are lots of different input parameter presentation properties, lots of things you can do with them. I talked about them earlier in this video series, so I'm going to wrap up our discussion about input parameter presentation for the moment, and I'm actually going to delete that input parameter we created because I don't need it for what I'm trying to display next. What I'm trying to display next is, again, if the answer to either of these questions was no, instead of just automatically create an attribute, what I do is ask myself can that input parameter presentation stuff help me to deal with the fact that the user doesn't understand the question or the user's not trustworthy? If yes, then I'll go ahead and create the input parameter. Again, go to the Input tab to do that. So if input parameter presentation can handle the situation, then I will go ahead and create an input parameter. The next question I would ask in that case is, which properties do I need? So for instance, do I need a default value like I just showed you how to set up? If the answer is yes, I'll go to the Presentation tab and I'll add that default value property that I showed you a few moments ago. And while I'm in there in the Presentation tab, I may as well ask myself, are there other presentation properties I would like to set? For instance, a minimum string length, maximum string length, or if I'm working with numbers, there are properties for minimum number, maximum number. If it's a string, I can use regular expressions to force the user to type an answer that fits some sort of pattern, some sort of format. Or I can create a drop-down list, and so on and so on and so on. Tons of things I can do with the input presentation. On the other hand, even if I don't need a default value, I'm still going to go to the Input Presentation tab. Pretty much anytime I create an input parameter, I go to the Presentation tab and ask myself which of these properties would be useful for the current situation. On the other hand, there are going to be some times where the input parameter presentation may not allow us to deal with the users who don't understand what's going on, or the users who are trying to be malicious. So if for whatever reason presentation's not going to help me, or, which is pretty rare, more commonly, if it's instead a situation where the developer of the Orchestrator workflow, want to have control, that's when I create an attribute. Again, we create attributes by going to the General tab. So if I create an attribute by going to the General tab, what I'm going to ask myself then is, should I hardcode the value? Well, if there's a schema element that is in my workflow that's going to set the value, well, I'm going to handle that a special way. Let me actually go back to the lab environment here, back to our earlier workflow where I have some attributes. But before we even look at the attributes, just notice this workflow is pretty straightforward. It has a start schema element, a action to get an array of all the VMs that are known to all my vCenter servers, all my hosts, all my clusters, and so forth. So that's an array of all the VMs, and this third schema element is just going to log information in the way that you see over here on the right side. So for each of the VMs in our array of VMs, we print out the name of the VM, the number of CPUs, the amount of memory, and then so that these don't all get smushed together, I'm logging a line of dashes here so that it will be more apparent. It'll be more apparent that this is one VM, this is one VM, this is one VM. So simple workflow. If you want to see the code that makes it work, you can see it down here, down below. You might want to perhaps even hit the pause button to study that code to see what it's actually doing. All right, welcome back. Now that you've studied how the code actually works, notice here that in my code, I have two different variables. Actually, there are three variables. This variable here called VM is actually just a local variable. It's local just to this one schema element. It's local, and therefore that's why the color coding of the variable name's black. But over here and here, I have two variables that we'll find out in a few moments are attributes. One's called all virtual machines, the other's called line. The variable called all virtual machines, as I'm sure you've already guessed, is an array of virtual machines, and it's that array of virtual machines that we're looping through here in order to create this log of information that we see over here on the right side of the page. On the other hand, down here on the bottom, you see a statement that says system.log line. And what that line variable is, again, it's an attribute that simply contains a bunch of dashes so that I can separate the different VMs in my output. Again, both of these variables, all virtual machines and line, are both attributes, and you can see that if we go to the Visual Binding tab. Actually, there are other places too we could go, but Visual Binding makes it real easy to see that the variables called all virtual machine and line are, as I said before, those are attributes. And in case you haven't noticed it here, all virtual machines, as I said, is an array of vSQL and virtual machines, and line, on the other hand, is just a string that contains whatever I want to use for the lines between these different VMs. So what I was just mentioning on the slide here is that whenever I create an attribute, I ask myself, is there a schema element in the workflow that's going to set the value of this attribute? For instance, in this particular case, the action here called get all VMs sets the value of the attribute called all virtual machines. You can see that if I select the action, you can see that in this binding here. The output of get all VMs is an array of vSQL and virtual machines, and it's getting stored into that attribute I mentioned before called all virtual machines. So in this particular case, this schema element is setting the value of an attribute. And as a consequence, let's see what our flowchart says. As a consequence, if there is a schema element that sets the value, then I'm done. I don't have to set the value. I don't have to hard code the value. I'm done. On the other hand, if there are no schema elements that set the value of the attribute in question, then I need to go to the General tab and find that attribute and hard code its value. And we can see that, again, back in our lab environment, we can see an instance of that if we look at our line variable. So there's nothing in any of these schema elements that assigns the value of line. Instead, I assign the value of line by hard coding that value when I create the attribute itself. And as you know from previous videos, the place where this all takes place is the General tab. So on the General tab, you'll notice that the variable called, the attribute called all virtual machines does not have a value set. And again, the reason why I did not set the value for that one is that attribute is getting its value set by get all VMs. On the other hand, this line variable this line attribute does not get its value set anywhere in the workflow. Instead, I need to set it. I need to hard code it, which I've done over here. And as you can see, if I wanted to, I could instead use equal signs as my delimiter. Maybe that'll make it even easier to see. But in my schema, when I run the workflow one more time, just to keep things exciting, but in the schema, when I'm creating input parameters, attributes, I will ask myself, is there a schema element that's going to set the value of an attribute? If so, I do not go to the General tab and hard code the value of that attribute. On the other hand, if there's nothing in the workflow, there's no schema element that's setting the value of an attribute, then it's my job as the developer to go to the schema tab, the General tab, and hard code the value of that attribute. Okay, so as you can see, we've now stepped through this entire flowchart to explain the thought process I go through when I create an input parameter or an attribute. And I hope that helps. Let me know down in the comments below if it does or doesn't help, or if you need another explanation, use the comments down below, let me know. What we're going to be talking about in the next video is the same sort of deal, except in that video we're going to be talking about the decision of whether to create an output parameter versus an attribute.